Hello, everyone, and welcome back. So now that you've gotten some background into globalization, migration, and social constructs, really the foundation of how intercultural exchanges are shaped, it is time to take more in-depth looks at how all of these things come together to affect how we interact with other cultures. One of the ways in which we engage in intercultural interaction is by trying to take part in other people's cultures. Some examples might include traveling to Guatemala and buying a traditional blanket from a local vendor, or doing something in your hometown, such as trying out an Indian restaurant in your neighborhood. Sometimes these exchanges are welcome. They come from a place of mutual respect and benefit, something which is called cultural exchange. Other times, however, these interactions come from a place of power and privilege. The goal of the person is not mutual benefit and sharing, but personal gain. This is known as cultural appropriation, and it will be the focus of this lecture. For several years, Ohio University had a "We're a Culture, Not a Costume" poster campaign on their campus. This campaign was in response to racist Halloween parties on college campuses across the country. Every year after Halloween, it is not uncommon to see someone, usually white, donning black and brown face and wearing costumes that depict stereotypical images of people of color. The photo on the left, for example, shows a white man wearing blackface and stereotypical African clothing. The photo on the right shows a white woman wearing brown face, pregnant, and smoking, an attempt to depict a Latina woman. The posters read, "You wear the costume for one night, I wear the stigma for a lifetime." The university released several of these posters, all combating racist and classist costumes geared towards, for example, Asian and African American men, as well as Middle Eastern women and poor Southern white men. All of these posters share a common theme, that by trying to depict a member of their culture for entertainment, not only shows a lack of awareness about their culture, but it reinforces the systemic oppression that stigmatizes them throughout their lives. This is what cultural appropriation is, and it is not always as overt as a racist Halloween costume. Even people wearing popular costumes like an Indian princess are not always trying to be hateful or dehumanize an entire group of people, but they do nonetheless. What all forms of cultural appropriation have, however, is that it is primarily meant for personal gain or entertainment, with little or no regard for its impact on members of that culture. Cultural appropriation entails the following. It's when members of a dominant group take elements from a culture that has been systematically oppressed by that dominant group. Dominant means a group that holds systemic power and privilege. Most of the people featured in the poster campaign were people of color who, historically and currently, live with the realities of systemic racism, which benefits white people. To have white people creating stereotypical costumes of people of color reinforces racism. In these cases, to be white is to be dominant. In the case of the white Appalachian man, the issue is class. A person who has been systematically oppressed based on class is being portrayed by someone who benefits from classism. In this case, the dominant group is middle and upper class. Another part of cultural appropriation is that the elements of a culture that have been appropriated are often things that that group has been stigmatized or systematically punished for. Sometimes cultural appropriation is meant to further stigmatize that group. Other times, the person who is appropriating another culture thinks they are engaging in cultural exchange, and they just don't understand the difference. I will discuss the difference between the two in a moment. And finally, cultural appropriation involves wanting the aspects of a culture that a person thinks is cool while being dismissive of systemic oppression against that group. One of the best, most recent discussions of cultural appropriation I have seen came from a young woman named Sanam. She is a Desi woman who attracted the attention of singer Rihanna for her use of Desi fashion. She was eventually cast as one of Rihanna's henchwomen in the song "Bitch Better Have My Money." In an interview with Refinery 29, she discusses appropriation of her own cultural fashion and symbols. And she said, Our culture isn't really respected unless it's things that people want to pick and choose. Growing up, I was made fun of for everything from my clothes down to what my lunch smelled like, to the point where I would throw it out before I even got to school because I was so embarrassed. People would make fun of our bindis and henna, saying that we were dirty, but I've literally seen some of those same people since then wearing bindis and getting henna and stuff. And it's like, you don't get to do that unless you've experienced what we've experienced. You don't get to do that until you realize what a big deal it is to wear those things proudly. It's not a fashion statement. It has cultural significance. It has religious significance. It's not funny to just put on a bindi and go to Coachella. The whole thing with cultural appropriation is people don't see where the line is drawn between appreciating and being disrespectful. If you're going to a wedding and someone wants you to wear a sari and Indian jewelry, that's one thing. You're being invited to share in that. But you don't come to something uninvited and just take whatever you want and not respect the experience and the culture. Sanam is making a very important distinction when she discusses being invited to participate in a culture, such as being asked to wear a sari at a wedding, and reducing an element of it for entertainment value, such as wearing a bindi to Coachella. She is distinguishing between cultural appropriation and cultural exchange. Whereas cultural appropriation is about power and personal gain or entertainment, cultural exchange comes from a place of mutual benefit and respect. A few differences between exchange and appropriation include that in cultural exchange, a person has typically been invited to participate in another culture. Cultural appropriation occurs when a person takes an element of another culture without any discussion or input from members of that culture. Cultural exchange comes from a place of respect. Cultural appropriation comes from a place of ownership and entitlement. In cultural exchange, there is recognition that you can never fully understand the importance of another culture, the experience. Since you are not a member of that group, you will never fully understand their experience, particularly the stigmas they live with. In cultural appropriation, a person often thinks they can develop a connection to a culture that is equal to members of that culture. In cultural exchange, the person cares as much about members of that culture. They care as much about the people as they do about the culture itself. In cultural appropriation, the person is largely dismissive of issues affecting members of the culture and often hold prejudiced views themselves. And finally, and most important, cultural exchange is about mutual benefit and sharing. Members of cultural exchange should be getting as much out of the interaction as you are. Cultural appropriation, on the other hand, is about power. There is no regard for whether or not members of that group are benefiting from your use of the culture. And by benefit, I mean benefiting on their terms. I will discuss that more in class. A common question I get when I discuss cultural appropriation is, so what? It is hard for some to see what the problem is with someone taking part in another culture, whether it is appropriative or not. It's sort of like all forms of appropriation are, at their core, appreciation. Everyday Feminism, an online website, offers 9 reasons why cultural appropriation is important to understand, but this is by no means an exhaustive list. It trivializes long histories of oppression. It allows people to express love towards a culture but maintain prejudiced racist views towards its people. It creates a double standard where a cultural element becomes okay for the dominant group but remains a stigma for members of the culture being appropriated. It allows people with privilege to profit off the culture of people without those same privileges. It lets some people get rewarded for things the original creators never received credit for. And it teaches us inaccurate lessons about the culture being appropriated. It perpetuates racist stereotypes. And people of the dominant group can freely do what members of the marginalized group were systematically punished for doing. And finally, it prioritizes the feelings of the dominant group over justice for the marginalized group. What I want to do before ending this lecture is bring this discussion back to intercultural praxis, specifically framing. Remember that framing is understanding how our racial, gender, class, and other social positions shape our worldviews. Cultural appropriation is an example of ethnocentric framing. If the primary purpose of cultural use is personal gain or entertainment, it reduces that culture to something trivial without any regard for how it impacts members of that group. That dismissal of the best interests of members of that cultural group is an example of ethnocentrism. So although cultural appropriation is a form of intercultural interaction, it is a form of intercultural interaction that comes from a place of power, privilege, entitlement, and is lacking reflection, positioning, and action, some other important elements of intercultural praxis. So to conclude, there's nothing wrong with appreciating other cultures. However, appreciation does not necessarily mean taking part, especially when uninvited and without fully understanding what you're taking part in. And most importantly, it is important to value the people as much as the culture. Here is a list of my references, and if you have any questions about the content, do not hesitate to ask.